read the first couple verses. And I'm not sure I have a particular reason for choosing these verses, but I mean, they're good verses, don't get me wrong, but question? Oh, okay, sorry, that's fine. Other than, we've had that, as we've kind of gone through this, the question of, what all that Calvin had done in Geneva and the other reformers, and then how it was done, we've asked the question, was this Christ-like? How, and that's a question that's kind of rolling around in my mind, and I think it's in some ways it's an easy question to answer, in other ways not so much, right? Calvin and the other reformers were very much products of their own time and their own culture, and that means they were imperfect people. I think, actually I'm quite confident that Calvin and the other reformers would have always said, don't look at us, look at Jesus, look at Christ, because they, I think, would have readily agreed that they were very imperfect people. And in spite of that, God, of course, uses them in great history-altering ways. And I think that's always an important idea for us to keep in mind. There's tons of Christian leaders who've come and gone throughout church history. Some of them have had a very powerful impact for the sake of the kingdom and for the gospel, and others have they've fallen, right? They've fallen into sin, or they've given into temptation, and then that's sort of disillusioning. If you've ever had someone that you admire in ministry, and whether it be a pastor, or whether it be like a well-known Christian figure, and then you come to find out that they give into temptation or they fall into sin, it rattles your faith. It certainly can. And this is not to downplay any of that, but it's a reminder that always the focus needs to be on Jesus. There's only one perfect church leader in history, right? There's only one, and that's these words from Hebrews 12, I think, maybe affirm us in that, or at least remind us of that. It's that assurance and that reminder to focus on Jesus. So Hebrews 12, I'll read the first two verses. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Keep in mind, when he talks about the great cloud of witnesses there, this is Hebrews 12, comes right after Hebrews 11. Challenging, right? But Hebrews 11 is a lengthy passage that talks, we sometimes call it the Hall of Fame of faith heroes, right? It's, Abraham, and it's Cain, or Abel, and it's not Cain. It's all these other people, and reminder of the lives that they lived. And sometimes the tendency, if you were to keep going, you could add other people throughout church history, including Calvin and Luther. But what we forget is that long list of people, the author of Hebrews was not trying to lift them up as the examples that we need to follow. What he was really trying to do is say, all of these people lived by faith in what was yet to come. And we have the substance of that. We have the one who has come. So yes, we can learn things from the life of Abel and Abraham and David and all these others, but they were looking ahead to Jesus, and we too have to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. And that's, I think, a good reminder as we study the life of Calvin and as we look at his ministry. Calvin needs to point us to Jesus. Imperfect, for all that Calvin did, he was, of course, an imperfect person, as were all the reformers, but the focus always needs to be on Jesus. I'm going to open with another prayer from Calvin. This one is called The Light of Thy Gospel. And so let's open our time with Calvin in prayer. Grant, Almighty God, that as thou hast been pleased to draw us at this day by the light of thy gospel out of that horrible darkness in which we have been miserably immersed, and to render thy face so conspicuous to us in the person of thine only begotten Son, that nothing but our ingratitude prevents us from being transformed into thy celestial glory. O grant that we may make such advances in the light of truth, that every one of us may be ashamed of his former ignorance, and that we may freely and ingenuously confess that we were lost sheep until we were by thy hand brought back into the way of salvation. And may we thus proceed in the course of our holy vocation, until we shall at length be all gathered into heaven, where not only that truth shall give us light, which now rules us according to the capacity of our flesh, but where also shall shine on us the splendor of thy glory, and shall render us conformable to thine image, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, we pick up in really at the edge of Geneva, or at the end of Calvin's first time in Geneva. Last time we were here, you'll remember that Calvin had spent about 2 years, maybe 2.5, it was about 2 years, maybe not quite 2 full years, in Geneva. And he'd implemented all of these reforms in Geneva, primarily having to do with discipline. It would be a lot about moral restraint. Remember, Geneva was a sort of Las Vegas of Europe at the time. There was a lot of immorality that was not only tolerated, but actually state-sanctioned and promoted. Remember, I mentioned that there was the position of the queen of the brothel. That was a state-funded position it's her job to oversee all of the brothels in town. So that gives you a sense of the level of immorality in the city. And Calvin and the other reformers were up against that. They had the task and the calling of trying to stem that behavior. And they came in, and because they saw the severity of things, they were pretty heavy-handed. They made a lot of good changes, but they also made a lot of changes that maybe were they to do it again, they would have been a little more tempered in how they implemented some of those changes. But there were also other factors. The city, even though the city wanted reform, or at least they said they did, there was that sense of there was political power behind the scenes that didn't want to give control over to these reformers. There was kind of the sense of, we are a reformed city, but we also kind of like how we're living. Change is hard, right? Any kind of change, and especially when you have to leave behind a way of life that you've enjoyed. To be disciplined and to be corrected out of that is not always easy. And so there's this building tension throughout Calvin's first time in Geneva. All of this comes to a head in the spring of the year 1538. What is happening is so some of it is this immorality and this stuff, but there's a couple of other factors that are sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, or sort of the kind of the lighting of the fire, so to speak, that leads to Calvin's ouster from Geneva. First thing is that there's a pastor, or he was a sort of I don't know if he was a pastor, he was a sort of a self-proclaimed theologian. His name was Peter Caroli. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. He was a Roman Catholic, but then he said that he converted to Protestant teaching and comes to Geneva. He had a reputation for being kind of just an agitator. So he wasn't one of these guys that you'd look at and say, well, he really is trying to bring about good change. He was one of these guys that liked to stir up trouble. And he did not like Calvin, he did not like Farel, and so one of the things that he did is he began spreading false accusations against Calvin and Farel. The most serious of them being that Calvin was an Arian, which is he denied that he's accusing Calvin of denying the Trinity, and that's because Calvin had some hesitation about signing the creed, the Athanasian Creed. I think it was the Athanasian Creed. Anyways, Calvin had some hesitation, but it was on a very minor technicality. It wasn't that Calvin denied the substance of the creed. It was just that there was some language in there that Calvin wasn't quite sure about, and so he was a little hesitant to sign it. Well, Calvin took that to mean that, Caroli took that to mean that Calvin denied the Trinity. And he spread this idea all the way around, and Calvin vehemently denied it. There was no question, of course, that Calvin believed in the in the Trinity and accepted the biblical and historical teaching of the Trinity. But that began to gain some traction, like especially Calvin's enemies. They took that as, oh, here's an opportunity that we can oust him on theological grounds, like Calvin denies the Trinity, and that, the Trinity, whatever else, however else you might have been living in Geneva, whatever else you might have been, kind of immorality you might have been practicing, or whatever theology you might have believed, you don't deny the Trinity. And so this was an opportunity for his opponents to stoke the fires of that. So that's one thing going on, and Calvin is working. In some ways he's distracted. He's got to put out these fires that really he shouldn't have had to been having to devote any attention to, but he is. And then so that's going on, and then you've got the question of outside influence. Bern was the provincial capital, you might say, and it had some, at least in terms of church, it had some influence, but Bern was coming along and said that all the churches in Switzerland, all the Swiss Reformed churches, had to use unleavened bread when they celebrated communion. Now, we touched on this last week. You and I would think, well, that's not that big of a deal, right? Like, okay, unleavened bread or leavened bread, probably there's no meaningful significance in that. And Calvin would have agreed with that on one level. He would have said, unleavened bread or leavened bread is not really the point. What he resisted was outside influence, outside people coming in and saying, you have to do it our way. And Calvin and Farel resisted that. It's not just that they had some discussion with that. It's that they refused to do what they were being told. And so that also begins to stoke these fires of resistance. So on Easter Sunday, Easter is supposed to be the most joyful day of the year. It's supposed to be a day where you set aside any, church controversy or church politics, but no such luck. Easter of 1538, they're supposed to celebrate communion, and they're supposed to, they're told that they have to use unleavened bread. Calvin and Farel refused not only to use unleavened bread, they refused to serve the sacrament. It was their belief that the people of Switzerland were living the sort of life that was not consistent with what God called them to live. And so when it comes time to serve communion, Calvin and Farel, they preached the service, they preached in the sermon, but they would not serve communion. And that sparked a riot, and I use that term literally, a riot in the church. So I'm thankful for all of you so much, because sometimes I probably say things that are you may wonder about or you may not agree with, but I've not yet had a riot at Sunny Slope Church, and that's a good thing. Back then, this sparked a riot, and so the people are in an uproar. Calvin had to leave the church, and he had to walk, I think I told you, it's maybe a third of a mile at best. He had to walk home under armed guard, because the people were trying to kill him or at least do him serious harm. So he walks that short distance, and his very life is in jeopardy at this point. And he's, so he goes home, he's under protection of it's crazy to my mind. He shows up that evening for church, and he preaches like nothing went wrong. He just, he was kind of one of these, it's church time, so I'm going to go and preach. And so he goes back to church and he preaches. It's strange to me to imagine, like as upset as the people are, they still come back to church and, sit through a worship service again like nothing happens. Like, well, okay. But that tells you how things are escalating. And I believe it was 2 days later that the church officially, or the city council officially voted to depose both Calvin and Farel. So they were ousted from office. In the meantime, I think it was probably leading up to that Easter, and then in those two days or so between Easter and the day they were officially deposed. It's kind of, I don't know, funny to me, maybe that's not the right word, but the level of agitation in the city was pretty strong. Like, and the way that people treated Calvin, they would, I don't know, how many are familiar with Nicky Nine Doors or Ding Dong Ditch, right? They would actually okay, so if you don't know what that is, like you go and you knock on the door and then you run away. And we had it happen in our house a couple months back. It was like 12:30 in the morning, and we hear this pounding. It's a little startling, right? You're thinking, what's going on? And okay, then fine. You just realize it's a bunch of kids just being kids, and okay, you don't really like that, but whatever. Well, that's what they were doing to Calvin. They would pound down his door, and then they would run away. And so Ding Dong Ditch originated in Switzerland in the 1500s, you can say. But they would also keep him up really late. They would go around his house, and they would yell these slogans. I forget exactly what it was, but it was basically something like, into the river with Calvin or something like that. I think it probably rhymed if you were to say it in French, but they were basically saying, we want you to drown in the river. So, you know, we've come a long way now. We have Pastor Appreciation Month, which is all very nice and kind. I didn't do that back then. So that gives you a sense of what life is like in Geneva. Calvin is deposed at a meeting of the city council on I think it was April 23rd, 1538. And the city celebrated. The city began sounding the bells in the churches, and there was like a party kind of thing breaks out in the city because they've gotten rid of Calvin and they've gotten rid of Farel. Calvin accepted it as dignified as you would hope he would. He said, okay, if this is what the people want, I'm not going to force my work on the people, and I'm not going to resist it in the sense of, you know, he's not going to try to stay in the city. If he's not wanted, he's going to leave. So that's what both he and Farel do. They leave Geneva, and they kind of travel around to a couple places first. They first went to, I think it was Zurich, where Heinrich Bullinger, I think it's Bullinger. Anyways, Heinrich Bullinger was there. He was another Swiss reformer, and he was a pretty even-tempered guy. He was... and so he actually welcomes in Calvin and Farel, and he helps them actually craft an appeal. He sort of says he wants to try to play the role of a peacemaker. So he's going to say, okay, what went wrong? Let's see if maybe we can appeal to the city council of Geneva, and maybe we can get you reinstated. So they try to do that, but in May of that same year, so May of 1538, they're unsuccessful. The city hears the appeal and denies it. And so Calvin and Farel are essentially now, they're left really without any recourse. It's not like they can try to get their way back into Geneva. And so they both go to different places. Farel goes to, and I don't always know how to say this, but Neuchâtel, probably saying that wrong. That's where Farel goes, and then Calvin eventually makes his way to Strasbourg. Remember, Strasbourg is where he wanted to go in the first place. He kind of had his heart set on just living a quiet, pastoral, theological life of theological study there. Well, he finally ends up there. And it turns out those years in Strasbourg were the happiest of his life. He would later say that those were some of the most fruitful years of ministry and some of the best times that he had in his life. I want to tell you a little bit about why and what happened all there, but before I get to that, are there questions on the events that led up to his expulsion from the city? Yeah, Jerry.
You said Farel also was deposed. What was his position?
He was the pastor. There was a Second Reformed church in Geneva. I don't mean like the church was called Second Reformed. It was Saint. It had another name, and he was the pastor of that church. It was not as large or prominent as the one that Calvin had. Calvin, it was interesting because Farel was about 20 years older than Calvin, and he had more experience, and he was the early leader in Geneva. But pretty quickly on, during Calvin's time in Geneva, it becomes obvious that Calvin is the more influential leader, and so they kind of trade places. Calvin becomes more influential. Farel becomes less prominent, but still very much tied up with the Reform movement. Farel was pastoring the other Reformed church in Geneva, and Calvin is pastoring the larger one of St. Pierre's. And so then but they're working together. They're pretty closely allied in their work, and so when one is expelled, the other is expelled. They both agreed together that they weren't going to serve communion, and so they were both expelled at the same time. Other questions? All right, so what happens in Strasbourg? Well, first of all, Strasbourg is not France, it's Germany at this point. I say that because it keeps switching back and forth, and so you can always tell if it's spelled the way I have it there, that's the German spelling. If it's spelled Strasberg, B-E-R-G, that's the French spelling. It's in this little part of France that kind of flips territory. And so I was really confused about that a little bit ago because I thought, France kicked out all the reformers, and yet how is it that they're back in France living a pretty peaceful life? And the answer is, well, they weren't in France. They were in Strasbourg, but Strasbourg at this time is part of Germany. So it's a very happy time in his ministry. What Calvin does is he becomes the pastor of a refugee church. So all of these French refugees, remember, are leaving France in droves because it's not safe for them to be there. And so off they go. They head to other places. Some of them go to like Holland and Belgium, and some of them make their way up to England. But a good number of them go to Geneva, not just Geneva, but Switzerland. and Germany, including the city of Strasbourg. And so you've got all these exiled, these communities of exiled French people who, I call them French Huguenots. That's actually not accurate. They were, they later became known as the Huguenots, but up until this point they were the French Reformed. And they were Huguenots when they got more closely associated with Calvin. So if that helps you, their theology was basically the same, but what happened was they, their French, the teachings of the Reformation had spread to France, and then these French refugees became known later as the Huguenots as they became followers of Calvin. So Calvin is pastoring this church. He's got about 4, depending on what source you look at, he's got between 400 and 600 people in his church, and they're all French refugees. They're all people who've escaped persecution in France, and they're really eager to learn the teachings of the Reformation. They're really drawn into Reformed theology, and so Calvin finds an opportunity to really engage in ministry, and his ministry was appreciated, and the people really loved Calvin. And he's able to do his writing. He writes the 2nd edition of his Institutes. He finishes that, and he's preaching at least 2 sermons every Sunday, and then he's preaching a couple times later throughout the week. He's able to do monthly communion. Remember, Calvin wanted weekly communion, but the city in Geneva wanted quarterly communion. So here he's able to do monthly communion. That's a good thing at this time. He's able to do this ministry. He's able to serve in the way that he'd always wanted to serve, and it was relatively free from major controversy. Now, that's not to say there weren't issues, because there were, but perhaps, this is just a speculation, but perhaps given his audience, his congregation, they were less preoccupied with the way of living, like in Geneva, they're all wrapped up in this way of immoral living. They've been able to do that for a very long time. They're not really, most of them are not fearful for their lives. And so, they're able, in this sort of prosperity and safety, they're able to be more agitating. I suppose that's one theory. In Strasbourg, the people there are refugees, they're exiles. They know what it's like to be on the run. They're not coming out of a life of real rebellion and sinful living, and so the dynamic is just different. And so he pastors this church for about 2.5 years or so, and it's a time of great blessing for him. It's a time of peace and tranquility. He's able to get a lot of his writing and ministry done. Some might say, though, the biggest benefit or blessing of this time in Strasbourg was that Calvin falls in love, and he actually gets married during this time. So Calvin was not, you would never find the story of Calvin on the Hallmark Channel. He is not one of these hyper romantic kind of guys. His relationship with his wife was not, it's not one of these warm, swooning kind of romance relationships where they're all just, there's none of that. But at the same time, it's not fair to say that Calvin's marriage was cold and simply for the, benefit of having someone to help him in ministry or something like that. They're really, Calvin, in some ways, when he did not go looking for a wife, but he had, after some time, he did conceive, he was 31, I think, when he gets married, and he had it when he's in Strasbourg. He had 2 other engagements 2 other women that he was engaged to, and both of those fell through. In one way, Calvin was a little bit gun shy of marriage, because he had a housemaid working for him, and she had, I think, 2 children, and this woman was quite a terror, and I don't mean that I'm not trying to, knock people or anything like that, but she was really a difficult woman, and Calvin just couldn't stand living with her. And so he's like, I don't want to, again, I'm not defending this, but his mindset was, I don't really want to live with a woman if that's what it's like to live with a woman. And so he was kind of resistant to the whole idea of getting married. But nonetheless, after a little time in Strasbourg, he becomes open to the idea. It's not like he was going out and, trying to meet women or something like that. But he writes to his friend Martin Bucer and says, well, if you know of somebody, I'd probably be open to considering it now. And so Martin Bucer fixes him up twice, and both times it didn't work. And then in the process of ministering among these French refugees, there was a family, and it was, I forget his name, I think I actually wrote it down, though. It was, yeah, I wrote down her name, but not his name. Anyways, so Idelette de Bure was a woman, and she and her husband, they had 2 kids, and they're French refugees. They left France, and they settled down in Strasbourg. Well, he gets sick with the plague. The plague is a big problem in Europe at this time, and lots of people are dying from it. Calvin later on will, when he goes back to Geneva, a huge chunk of his pastoral ministry will be involved with caring for the victims of the plague. But in the meantime, this family, he passes away from the plague, leaves her as a widow with 2 children. And Calvin knew this family, and he knew Idelette and the 2 children before he even was thinking about dating, marriage. They didn't really date back then, I don't think, but you get the idea. But he, so when he goes looking for a wife, he's not really putting any attention on romance or physical attraction or anything of that sort. He really just wants someone who can be there for, assistance in ministry. He wants someone who can be kind of a good companion and a good fit for her. And so he, in our minds, that's not, that's part of what makes a good relationship. But, our culture tends to put a lot more focus on the emotional side of it and the feelings and the romance and all that. Calvin really wanted nothing to do with that, which is kind of what leads a lot of people to say, well, Calvin was one of these just stoic and boring guys. That's really not a fair thing. But in any case, he meets Idelette de Bure after her, her husband dies, leaving her a widow with two children. And Calvin, after a very brief courtship, they become engaged, and I think it was in August of 1540. So they've been there about a year and a half, almost 2 years, actually just over 2 years. They get married in Strasbourg, and their marriage actually was a very, very happy marriage. And over time, Calvin really developed a deep love and affection for her. And I say that not meaning that he didn't love her at the beginning. I just mean that their relationship really grew and blossomed into something that was, I think, really an ideal picture of what marriage ought to look like. After just to give you a sense of that, after she passes away, they had only been married 9 years. So that's, for some of you, maybe that feels like a long time. Others of you, that's like, well, that goes by real quick. I guess it depends on if you've been married and how long and that. But for me, 9 years doesn't sound like all that long. But they were married 9 years, and she dies. She was not in good health for much of their marriage. She had a lot of chronic illnesses and things, and so that probably shortened her life considerably. And then Calvin writes to his friend. He says this, and I think these words are, I'm not a hopeless romantic either, but these words I think are pretty, beautiful reflection of their relationship. He wrote, he says, "I've been bereaved of one of the best companions of my life, of one who, had it been so ordered, would not only have been the willing sharer of my indigence, but even of my death. During her life, she was the faithful helper of my ministry." So she was the sort of, what he's saying by that is, here's someone who was willing to suffer poverty, and even, knowing Calvin knew he wasn't in great health either, she would suffer and share poverty with him, and she would even, was willing to even be there when he died, and to endure that as well. And so he really saw her as a great companion. And to make it a little personal too, we had Willie Vanscape in service yesterday, and that's one of the things that came out was she was a companion in ministry, and I think I thought of that when I kind of thought these two folks together, Pastor John and Pastor John, I guess you could say. But yeah, that sense of partnership in ministry, that she helped him be a better pastor. She helped him to serve the churches that God had them serve. I think that's true of Pastor John Vanscapen and Pastor John Calvin. That was a large part of her legacy that she left. So she was a great support, and it was very difficult when Calvin lost her. He was deeply grieved, and after his grief, he threw himself into his work. By this time, of course, they're back in Geneva, so we're jumping ahead a little bit, but he committed himself to resuming his work and his ministry and jumping full on into that again. He experienced a lot of pain. He adopted the 2 children, so Idelette had 2 children, and the 2 of them had, I think, 3 children together, but they died all in infancy. I think they were either stillborn or one of them, I think, lived a couple weeks. And so that too, Calvin would write on that later on. He would talk about how profound that grief was, and you can read the letters that he wrote after that. I'm trying to think if I wrote any of those down. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I almost skipped a good chunk here, but he says this after the first son. He says this: "The Lord has certainly inflicted a severe and bitter wound in the death of our infant son, but God is himself a father and knows best what is good for his children." And then the third son. So I couldn't find anything after the loss of his second son, but after the third son, he writes again to a friend: "The Lord has certainly inflicted a heavy and severe wound on us by the death of our little son, but he is our father, and he knows what is expedient for his children." So you hear in both of those things that Calvin is not a Stoic, right? He's not someone of, we just got to trust God, and God's in control, so he doesn't stifle down his feelings. He acknowledges the pain of loss and the grief. He's very honest about that, but he does also hold that together with the trust in the providence of God, that even in this kind of terrible loss, and I don't know about you, you think about what would it be to lose your child in infancy, and in the midst of that, he's able to hold on to and to trust that not only that God allowed this, but God caused it, right? I mean, God inflicted the wound, says Calvin. Now, I'm sort of putting that in front of you because when we talk later on, we're going to come back to the doctrine of providence. You're going to hear Calvin say this again. He's going to say it in a more theological way. He's going to talk to us about how even bad, even evil, comes to us from God. Now, he's going to nuance that more than I just did. But I draw your attention to that now because when you hear something like that, like if I were to come to you and say, well, listen, God causes, God even sends you suffering. There's a part in us that's going to want to resist, and in a way, I haven't suffered a whole lot in my life, comparatively speaking. And so it's one thing when someone tells you that and they've not really experienced much, right? But Calvin is speaking from experience, so he's speaking even on his own reflection and the pain in his own life, and he still acknowledges God's sovereignty even in the face of great loss. As Idelette was getting sick and nearing the end of her life, Calvin, it's kind of funny, Calvin comes along and he wants to reassure her. He wants to say, listen, I'm going to take care of your children. I'll take care of them as my own. And Idelette basically says something like, no, you won't. I've already entrusted them to God. So, God's going to take care of them. Now, she was, of course, acknowledging that Calvin would be the one to do this, but he was sort of the way he was framing it, or the way that she framed it was, God is really the one who's going to provide the care here. So that maybe gives you a window into her level of trust as well. She really had a strong and solid faith in God. So Calvin, Idelette basically says, I've already committed them to God. So, don't think that you're stepping up and doing something heroic here. God is the one taking care of it. So, any questions on just the marriage of Calvin? I've got a few thoughts on just what I think are takeaways, but any thoughts or any questions on the life of and marriage of Calvin and Idelette? Couple things I think that are worth lessons worth learning. Calvin viewed the marriage relationship as a window into the relationship between Christ and his church. And of course that idea is not new with Calvin. That's a Ephesians 5 idea, that's a biblical idea, but Calvin really emphasized that point. He really saw the joy of relationship between husband and wife, and the intimacy and the vulnerability and the trust and commitment and all of the other aspects of it. He really saw that that was meant to point us beyond the marriage relationship itself and was meant to point us to God. So he says this, he says, "It is a thing against nature that anyone should not love his wife. For God has ordained marriage in order that two may be one person, a result which certainly no other alliance can bring about. When Moses says, quoting from the Old Testament, that a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, he shows that a man ought to prefer marriage to every other union as being the holiest of all. It reflects our union with Christ, who infuses his very life unto us. For we are flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone. This is a great mystery, the dignity of which cannot be expressed in words." So, again, I don't know if that fits on a Valentine's Day card, right? That's not exactly but you hear the rich theology that Calvin draws from the teaching of marriage and how he experienced that in his own life. Now, I don't think Calvin would say that everyone must get married, and I don't think even that's his point here, but I think what he's saying is the marriage relationship offers something that no other relationship is able to offer, and that is to point us to what God's relationship with us is about. And I would add to that, because there are single people, and then you think, well, are they somehow second class? And the answer, of course, is no. I think marriage can still point you to the nature of God and how he relates to us, right? I mean, even if you're a single person, you can look ideally, hopefully, at a good example of marriage and say, yeah, that's how God relates to his people. So anyway, and that's another big topic, of course, but I think Calvin has a lot to teach us in terms of his theology of marriage and what that actually. It's not just, especially in our culture, marriage has undergone some really dramatic changes in terms of how we view it. It's a relationship of convenience a lot of times. It's like, well, as long as we're both happy, great. And then when we just don't feel the sparks anymore, it's like, well, we just part ways. And Calvin, I think, would really be shocked at that. He would really be concerned about that. And I think as Christians, we got to make sure that we're promoting a good and ideal, healthy picture of marriage in our community. In other words, it's not just for married couples, but as a community, we ought to be promoting the idea of what a biblical marriage is meant to be. The other thing is Calvin's trust in God through the midst of adversity. Calvin really experienced hardship in his life and in his marriage. And yet he maintained his trusting in the sovereignty of God, and I've kind of talked a little bit about that and said a little bit about that. I want to just finish up for now with kind of because it's going to bridge into next week. So this is Strasbourg. Calvin, life is going overall really well in Strasbourg for Calvin and his ministry, and he's married, and he's got a couple little kids now that he's adopted. Things are not going well in Geneva. Things have actually fallen apart very, very quickly. The city council, the power is shifting in the city council, and so they're allowing things to go back to the way that they once were. And so, what that means is that immorality is spreading again. People are allowed to, visit the brothels again without consequence, and drinking and dancing and all kinds of immorality. They actually the city council fired a bunch of the teachers that were actually good teachers in the schools. Remember, Calvin started up these schools at the beginning of his time in Geneva, and the city council basically came along and fired a bunch of the good teachers and left the really poor teachers in their place. So it's like, there's that politics stuff there that's happening behind the scenes. Pastoral care is being neglected. The pastors that were put in place in Geneva in Calvin's absence and Farel's absence were really not effective pastors. They weren't effective preachers. They weren't visiting the sick and so on. So the city is really feeling Calvin's absence. And then two other kind of things are happening politically. Some of the former agitators that were really causing trouble for Calvin, they die. And so things, there's a shift again in terms of the power and influence in the city. The real tough people are gone. Even though the city council, the power is still very much on permissiveness, the troublemakers are gone, and the people in power are beginning to realize things aren't going so well in Calvin. And the Roman Catholic Church is beginning to gain ground again. The Catholic Church is their influence, and all of a sudden people realize, oh yeah, we've lost out on, we're going back to what we wanted to get rid of, and that's not a good thing. So that's, and then Calvin is mellowing, right? Calvin, I talked to you about that last time. Calvin was young when he left Geneva. He was younger when he started. He was, I think, 25 or so when he starts, and 27 by the time he's kicked out of the city. And so in that time, he's grown up a little bit, and he actually did realize, and with the help of Bollinger, he realized that he'd probably been a little too heavy-handed in the way that he implemented some of these reforms. So there's kind of this movement that, okay, in Geneva, whoa, we've made a big mistake. Calvin has realized, I maybe didn't always do things so well either. I'm going to give you the short version of the story. They come back to Calvin and they plead with him, please come back. We need your help. Things are not going well without you. We want you back. And Calvin doesn't want to go. He's like, why should I leave what's going so well? Why should I go back to Geneva when I was so poorly treated? Well, and he actually called Geneva the abyss. Why should I return to the abyss? Right? That sounds like pretty daunting. But he writes to Calvin, or to Farel, he writes in a letter, he says, when I remember that in this matter I am not my own master, I present my heart as a sacrifice and offer it up to the Lord. If you've seen that logo before, that's the logo of Calvin, now Calvin University, and you can see around the side of it, my heart I offered you to you, Lord, promptly and sincerely. That quote is from when Calvin was asked to come back to Geneva, and that was his response. So he didn't want to, but he was willing. He sensed it was God's will. And so September 1540, Geneva agrees to call Calvin back, and by May of 1541, so 3 years after almost 3 years after he's kicked out, or a little over 3 years after he's kicked out, he's back. He returns to Geneva for his second sojourn there in the city. Are there any questions, real briefly? I went a little long, I apologize for that, but if you have any questions.
He is married when he comes back, right?
He is married when he comes back, that's right, yeah. He and Idelette, they come back together, and they're there together, so. Any other questions? All right, then, thanks for your attention again. Sorry, I went a little long there. Let me close in prayer for us. Father, we thank you again that you work through imperfect people, and that your sovereign power and plan and purpose are not limited in any way by the failures and the weaknesses of your servants. We thank you that we learn this lesson from Calvin. It's a good reminder that you deal with us in much the same way, so thank you for that. As we continue our day of worship today, we pray that you would receive all the honor and glory, and that we would be encouraged again to look to you in faith and in trust in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we'll pick it up next week with Calvin's second visit to Geneva.